This is my performance assessment development project for post-university. The course is EDU 607 by myself, Kristen Sweeney. So the standards that I focus on and spent time deconstructing are 8.EE.C.8, which is analyzing and solving pairs of simultaneous linear equations, as well as 8.EE.C.8c, which is basically a branch off of that other standard, and it's solving real-world and mathematical problems leading to linear equations in two variables. So essentially the goal here is to take a word problem and be able to write two linear equations and then solve them specifically using the substitution method. So this is my performance assessment that I created. Students have to decide what the better deal is. They're looking to buy a new iPhone and they come across a situation where they have to compare AT&T plan to Verizon plan. So they both have a different upfront fee or a sign-up fee, and then a different monthly payment, and they have to decide which plan would be the better deal in the long run, about 2 years later. So these are the expectations that go along with the performance task. As you can see, students need to apply and extend previous understandings of decoding and deciphering word problems. With this assessment, there are certain directions that need to be carried out, such as creating two tables of values, one for the AT&T plan, one for the Verizon plan. They also need to define what their independent and dependent variables are, and also create two equations either from the tables or from the scenario itself. So in order to write the equations for the tables, they first have to be able to identify the slope or the rate of change, as well as the y-intercept or initial value. So once they have the two equations written, they then have to solve the two equations using the substitution method. While they are solving, they also need to provide an explanation of each step they took throughout the solving process. Then once they come to the solution, they have to interpret that solution in the context of the problem and then use that solution to help them determine which plan would be the better plan at 2 years. So once they do all of that, they then need to create a poster that basically details the scenario, illustrates the two tables, provides the two equations, has the entire solving process, and again, an explanation of each step they took, as well as a final concluding answer. So there's 4 different learning targets here that I changed into I can statements. The first thing that students should be able to do, well, they should be able to create a table of values from a given word problem. Another thing students should be able to do, they should be able to identify the rate of change and initial value from a given word problem or table, and then use that to write the equations. Students should also be able to solve a system of equations using the substitution method. And finally, explain the solution to the system of equations and interpret its meaning based on the context of the problem. So these 4 targets here need to be met for any performance task to be successful. So the first thing I'm going to focus on is knowledge. So students should know how to construct a table of values. They should understand how to deduce an equation. They should be able to identify the rate of change in initial value from a table. So rate of change is simply your change in y over change in x versus your initial value. The question we ask ourselves is, well, what is y when x is 0? They should also know the steps of solving systems of equations by substitution, and they should also know that the solution is the case, in this case, is where the companies are charging the same amount of money. In terms of reasoning, students should be able to apply previous understandings of solving word problems. They should be able to explain which x values they chose and why they chose those arbitrary x values in their table. They should also be able to justify which company is the better deal and why. Also, supporting their stance with evidence is, when determining which company is better is necessary. And finally, they'll have to explain the significance of the point of the solution. In terms of skills, well, one skill that students need to know and be able to carry out are creating tables of values. So, they have to be able to pick those x values, plug them into the equation, and then solve correctly to get the corresponding y values. They also need to practice writing equations in slope-intercept form, given a table of values or scenarios. They have to practice identifying slope and y-intercept from tables and equations. And they also have to solve system of equations through the substitution method. So notice how it's similar to knowledge. However, for knowledge, they simply just have to know the steps, versus skills, they're actually carrying out the steps of the solving process. So for example, they practice isolating the variable, substituting it into the other equation, utilizing inverse operations. So those skills are really put into action. Finally, the product is that students will be creating a poster with a detailed explanation of the scenario. And the poster should include various things such as, the two tables, one for each company, the two equations, the whole process of solving through substitution, and a detailed response answering the question. So GRASP is another neat little acronym that stands for goals, role, audience, situation or procedure, and finally product. That, the instructor or facilitator or teacher should, keep in mind while designing a performance test. So the goal here was to create two tables and write two equations for each company from the given scenario, and then use the substitution method to solve the system of equations and help determine which company would be the better choice at 2 years. The role of the students is to decide between the two phone companies. My students are about 14 years old and they all have cell phones. They love their iPhones. And, in a few years, they might be paying for their own iPhone. So to them, it's valuable knowing how to determine which company would be the better deal. In terms of audience, students will be presenting their findings to their classmates and have to justify their stance to all of us. The situation is pretty evident. It's outlined very clearly, but again, they're creating the two tables, writing the two equations, solving through substitution, and then finally answering the question, which company is the better deal 2 years later. And the product that the students are creating is a poster that illustrates all of that information. Here's the rubric I created for this performance task. Notice how there are 6 different categories. So one thing I'm looking for is the scenario or the intro. How well did the students explain and elaborate on that? Another thing is the tables. So, this ranges from poor, fair, good to excellent. So the tables, well, are they correct? Number 1, do they have an X and a Y? Are they labeled? What's the independent variable? What's the dependent variable? Are the corresponding Y values correct? Did they solve for the Y values correctly? In terms of a written equation, are the equations accurate? So maybe the equation is partially accurate. Maybe they have the right slope, but not the y-intercept. So partial credit can be given here. In terms of solving, again, this rubric accounts for a few mistakes, minor mistakes, as well as, all of the work and steps shown. Just being very thorough. So as long as the students solve it all correctly, use their inverse operations, the arithmetic is correct, and they're showing all work and just being very thorough, they would get an excellent here. In terms of the answer, so the answer must be clear. It has to be labeled correctly. So with word problems, we always have labels in our answer, as well as an elaboration piece. They're explaining how they got to their answer. And then, of course, creativity. I'm big on creativity, and I wanted to include this on the rubric since they're creating a poster. When I went to critique my performance task assessment, I felt that students would be clearly able to identify the purpose and goal of this assessment just based on that scenario and the question at the end of the scenario there, which is to help determine which company will be the better deal at the end of the 2 years. I also felt that the learning targets were very clear and concise. I bullet pointed them on the student handout. I believe the design of the assessment was, pretty clear and thorough. The directions and expectations were outlined. The rubric is informative and broken out into several different subcategories. There are controls for bias, as certain requirements are non-negotiable or arguable. For example, having a label on an answer. So that's either you have the label or you don't, right? Obtaining the correct slope or y-intercept. So again, you either have the right slope and y-intercept or you don't. There's no arguing that. Using the substitution method, so you either use inverse operations correctly and isolated the variable correctly, or you made minor mistakes. So it's pretty straightforward there. I also believe that there's effective communication. Students are expected to explain their thought process and steps for solving the system of equations, and finally justify their answer and support their answer with evidence. Finally, students are required to be truly involved and engaged throughout the completion of this performance task. Students can self-assess by comparing their work to the given rubric. So to sum it all up, I learned a lot from doing this project. I learned that performance tasks should hit all 4 targets: knowledge, reasoning, skills, and product. Expectations should be clearly indicated and outlined on the student handout and also reflected in the rubric. Students should know the goal, role, audience, situation, procedure of the task, and the product they need to create. One good strategy for this is to go over the expectations on the handout with the students and then ask them, okay, so what is the goal? Well, what's your role? Who is your audience? What is the procedure here? What are you going to have to do? And then finally, what are you going to have to create? And kind of put it back on them. Students should be engaged and be provided with opportunities to be creative, which again is why I included that piece on the rubric. Students should be provided with a non-biased rubric that has several categories and sublevels, allowing for partial credit as well. So students may use the rubric to further see what is expected of them and later self-assess their work. And finally, here are my references for this presentation.